From FingerLakes1.com, this is the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined as always by my co-host, Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. We have got a big show planned today. We are less than 24 hours removed from Election Day. Ted, we made it through. We only got yelled at a little bit after last week's show, but here we are. We're alive and well. Before we get into all the results and what we thought was interesting or not so interesting, any Election Day traditions that you've held on to over the years since you've worked in news and broadcasting?
Just mostly hoping it's over. Other than that, no, it's we don't do the live wall-to-wall thing anymore just because, as you're going to talk about, it takes so long to get some of these results from some of the rural precincts that you wind up going to bed at midnight and getting up at 4, and I'm cranky enough with a full night's sleep, never mind getting
I feel that.
Shrift.
Yeah, and I guess that's probably a good place to start before we actually get into results and stuff here. It's like every year. Normally we do the election night live broadcast. We'll usually stay on for 2 or 3 hours until most of the results are in. This year we didn't do that for a whole host of reasons. We didn't do it last year because of the changes to the election calendar and how votes were being calculated versus how they were previously being calculated. But I'll tell you what, like every single year it becomes this like cat and mouse game of trying to figure out where the results are going to be, how they're going to be publicized by each individual Board of Elections group. And unfortunately, there are these like outliers, I suppose. And I have to give I'm going to criticize one county, and I have to give credit to another who I think did an exceptional job compared to how they've performed historically. Let's start with them, Yates County. Normally, they are one of the last counties that we see results from. They usually are the last ones to update their PDF that shows all the results. And that's typically because they don't do what Ontario and Cayuga and Seneca and even Schuyler does, which is kind of batch it. So you'll get one PDF when 20% in, another one when 50% in, maybe another when 80 or 90 are in. Yates has historically just done it in one drop. And they did, but the amazing thing was, I think that drop came a few minutes before 10 o'clock, which is astounding. They beat their own expectations. They had posted on their website that by about 10:15 is when the results should start being posted. And, I was really impressed with that. Now, the opposite side of the coin, I said I was going to criticize somebody. Wayne County, please get it together. It's just insane. It is 2021, and not only do they have a new website, Wayne County, remember, it was just in the headlines like 2-3 weeks ago. They have this fancy, awesome new website. And it's still like trying to find a needle in a haystack looking for results. You're a board of elections, and this is one of my criticisms of all counties. There should be a single policy or a single process for publishing results, not just for news and media, but so the general public can access it too. If you're looking for results in, say, 3 or 4 different counties, you are going through 3 or 4 different processes. You are being fed through and looped through 3 or 4 different methods for how each county actually serves results. So in some cases, like Ontario County, you have to download a PDF file every single time you want to look at results. Yeah. And that's even just to check to see if the results have been updated. So by the time last night closes out, I'm of course the one posting all of the election results that are on our website. By the time election night closes out, I have about 32 PDFs in my downloads folder because I've just been hitting election results 2021 over and over again. And now, at least they're publicizing results in a quick way. I just think across the board, Board of Elections have to do it better. I do like the way Seneca County did it this year. Seneca County basically put it all on their front page, more or less. So the further you scrolled down, you would eventually get to it, and you just had to refresh one page. But every other county that we cover, I'm talking about Cayuga, Wayne, Seneca, or Schuyler, Steuben, Tompkins, Yates, they all do it differently, and you have to go through different channels and link paths to eventually get to the spot where the election results are, and it is never, ever, ever clear if you're going the right, but like it's just a guessing game until you. So once you find it, you have to just leave it up for the rest of the night. It's a little bit. I'm sorry to start the show off with a rant
Well,
like that.
I mean, it's
but
one of our ongoing themes is that government is way behind the private sector in tech. We've said that in a number of different capacities, and this is another one. I mean, it really shouldn't. It's simple data entry, and it should only take somebody. That's something an intern should be able to do 2 minutes after the results are in.
Well, and on top of that, I think I would assume that most counties and most districts in the Finger Lakes anyway are significantly smaller, or there are fewer of them than there were probably 20 or 30 years ago. And yet it seems like results are not coming any more quickly, even though there are, in theory, fewer places to go collect votes from and bring them back and transport or communicate them, however they're doing that.
And you have early voting now, so more of the votes are done before Election Day anyway, so there's fewer people voting on Election Day.
I should hand out this piece of criticism because it wasn't just acknowledged by me, but it was acknowledged by Robert Harding from The Citizen. Cayuga County decided, I don't even understand what the thought process was behind it. They had two separate PDFs, one for early voting totals and one for Election Day totals. They did not math the two out together at all. So anybody who was looking at them had to take numbers from one PDF and add them to another PDF where the numbers were not yet complete. I mean, come on, people. These are just little things that need to be made. It's funny because we're going to talk about turnout here in a little while. And, one of the things that makes people not want to engage with politics is unnecessary confusion and labor like this. Like just finding out who won your local town supervisor race should not take an act of Congress, but it seems like in some places, in some rural parts of the Finger Lakes, that's exactly what it does. Results. Was there anything that stood out to you as far as the results from this crop of local elections?
Well, I think the first thing is the Seneca Falls Town Board. We got some criticism last week. Attorney Emil Bovee emailed both you and I. He came on the air on my show and talked about what he thought were the inaccuracies in some of the things that I said. So it sounds to me like town residents have decided that the revenue the landfill brings in is worth whatever inconvenience it causes. And I have to believe that, like I said, for most people in town, I don't think it's a big factor. Unless you live right across the street, you're not going to smell it. You're really not going to see it. But you're going to have that money that comes in. And that was maybe I didn't express it well, but because Mr. Bovee came on and talked about where the landfill money was going. He said that not all of it goes into the general fund directly to reduce taxes. That may be true, but that's not really the point. The point is it's $3 million in revenue. If it goes away, you have to account for that somehow in your budgeting. Whether that money is being socked away in a rainy day fund, then that rainy day fund is going to go down. So I think that the voters decided that, and again, in my opinion, the anti-landfill candidates, the incumbents, didn't really make clear how they'd account for that money. They just sort of went on the theory that, don't worry, it's all magic, it'll take care of itself. So that was the first thing that really stood out.
Yeah, and I think just as a sort of follow-up to that, one of the pieces of I wrote a column that we ran on Finger Lakes One a couple days after the podcast, sort of breaking down the numbers and where it comes from and where the money ultimately goes that is coming from the Seneca Meadows landfill to the town of Seneca Falls. And it's interesting because several readers reached out afterward and said, you're talking about using reserves. You're talking about using reserves. Read through that column 50 times. There is no mention of using reserves in any way, shape, or form. The simple acknowledgement that reserves are being bolstered. And right now there's a little over $9 million in reserves. And that number is going to keep growing because the town has chosen not to tap into those reserves to offset what are incremental tax increases. And it's interesting because this is one of those things that's lost on a lot of people, I think, who don't follow how town governments are supposed to manage money closely, is that the state doesn't want you to have a large reserve balance, like ever. And stashing money away in reserve sounds really nice on paper. And of course, it's good to have a rainy day fund. But the state, especially when the comptroller's office gets involved, really does not like a town to be carrying a large reserve balance because it means they're unnecessarily stuffing money away when they could be using it to offset taxes. That said, all of this debate about landfill revenue, whether to use it or to not use it, whether the landfill should be here or should not be here, hopefully that part of it can be put to rest for a while, because at this point, what the town really needs to be looking at is how it's going to spend money and how it's going to save money and what services it values and what ones will inevitably need to be cut. Because at the end of the day, hate to be the bearer of bad news here, the landfill isn't going to be around forever. And whether it's 2025, 2039, 2050, 2060, it doesn't matter. Like, whatever that date is, eventually the money is going to stop coming. And the town needs to start thinking about where it is now, where it wants to be in 5 or 10 years, especially on the infrastructure side. And it needs to start positioning itself not as a community that's already 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years behind in infrastructure, but one that's getting ahead while it can right now, so that it can be ready for that eventual closure, because eventually it will actually close. Another caveat on that discussion that we had about the landfill and about the town of Seneca Falls, I had made the point that I was not convinced that the DEC and the state would simply step aside and let the town of Seneca Falls shut down, by virtue of local law, one of the state's largest landfills. And I explained kind of why that may or may not be the case in that column that I wrote last week. But I reached out to the DEC, and to say that the DEC sidestepped the core question, which is, will the state side with Seneca Falls if Seneca Falls opts to close the landfill, would be the understatement of the century. They very vaguely and broadly said that, it's ultimately up to Seneca Falls, but there was no definitive stance of, yes, we will support Seneca Falls if that's the direction they choose to go. Now, I understand that is a large state entity choosing its words very wisely, but given the tact that I think a lot of the landfill opposing crowd has taken over the last 2 to 3 to 4 years, this hope, or I should say blind hope, that the DEC and the state is going to back them if they are ultimately the ones that are in control and in power in 2025. I don't think that kind of confidence should be given to the state, especially given the conversations we've had on this program about the lack of confidence most of us have with New York State.
Right. Well, and two other issues, we talked about this morning on my show, is, do you really want every election in the town of Seneca Falls to be a referendum on the landfill and nothing else? I mean, there are a lot of other issues, and those don't even get discussed in the campaign. And then something I've complained about over the years is that there used to be kind of a principle that when an issue was settled, it was settled. And if you lost, better luck next time. But now everything gets reopened. So, I mean, in the next election, there's going to be another slate of anti-landfill candidates, and they're going to make the same arguments. And, we're going to go through this again, because there's no sense anymore that when something's decided, it's decided. The Supreme Court can rule on something, and the opponents will keep trying to get it overturned anyway. So, the town has some other issues it should be dealing with, rather than just holding a landfill referendum every 2 years.
Yeah, and I think I want to talk a little bit about turnout, because I thought it was interesting. You sort of look broadly across the region, whether you're talking about bigger city races or bigger county races in like Monroe County, or you're talking about some of the rural contests in like a Wayne County for sheriff, or even the Seneca Falls and Seneca County races. And it's interesting because big or small, Democrats tended to underperform, it seemed, where they took voters for granted. Pointing on the state side, of course, the Buffalo mayoral race was the one that everyone was pointing to, saying, this is a shock, can't believe this happened. Obviously, you had India Walton, who had won the primary, significantly won the primary, just get absolutely clobbered last night by a write-in campaign. And it's this passiveness, I think, and same goes for, to some degree, I think the same thing played out in Seneca Falls, where there are folks who feel very strongly about the landfill and how it shouldn't be in Seneca Falls or shouldn't continue to operate in Seneca Falls, and think that because they feel that way, a majority of other people do too. And unfortunately, like, it puts you in a very bad spot when you're trying to win an election. You can't take voters for granted, and you can't just passively go through a campaign. You just can't. And I understand, like, people who are listening to this, all due respect to the candidates who ran, whether you win, lose, or draw, running for office is a serious undertaking. And I'm not saying that anybody, didn't do as much as they could or as much as they felt like they could. But I think some of the processes that people have leaned into historically, and how you go about winning local races, how you go about winning a race for mayor or whatever the case may be, a lot of those practices are kind of gone by the wayside. Social media rules the day, and I think even in local races now we're to a point where if you don't have a really strong social media game, you probably aren't going to get too many people excited about you.
Well, and I think there's a growing sense in a lot of people that it just doesn't matter. I think a lot of people feel like it's the same old, no matter who I vote for. But you brought up Buffalo, so I did want to talk about that for a moment, because I've said many times, why do we have primaries? Why are we wasting our time? The Democratic voters of Buffalo made it clear who they wanted to be their nominee, and the party said, well, that's tough. We don't want her. We want Byron Brown back. And so India Walton was lacking in what could have been some key endorsements, including right at the very top. The governor didn't endorse her. I think Chuck Schumer did late and reluctantly. Kirsten Gillibrand did less reluctantly. And so what's the point if the parties just go back to the smoky rooms? If the Democratic Party is going to disregard the wishes of its voters, then why go through the charade of a primary in the first place? Just go in the back room and pick who you want.
Well, I guess my issue with that would be then the complacency that a candidate has after they win a primary. You win a primary, even if you're the underdog in that first battle, you really need to take that energy and you need to be the underdog the whole way through. Because I've never, and I understand the parties have a great deal of influence and they have a great deal of power, but I can't believe that a write-in candidate secured close to 60% of the vote.
Well,
that is astounding.
And here's the interesting thing, too. He wasn't just a write-in candidate, he was a stamp-in candidate. You probably heard the story. They distributed tens of thousands of rubber stamps with his name on them so that voters didn't have to take the effort to walk in and write his name down. They would walk in and stamp his name down. So, I think it's, and frankly, we had this discussion. I think one of the greatest political successes of the last several decades is people on the right defining socialism as some scary boogeyman thing to be feared. So anyone who gets that tag attached to them is doomed. Every story this morning mentioned India Walton was a socialist. It didn't say Byron Brown was a bought and paid for corporate capitalist who ran Buffalo into the ground in the first place, and why are you giving him 4 more years to do it even more?
Yeah.
Little opinion there.
And let's also not forget the fact that, when everything is counted up and we're looking at this whole thing in total, I mean, it is pretty remarkable that a race could turn out the way it did, given the forces that are in play there. I mean, to really think about who's to blame. There's going to be a lot of villainization of Republican voters and Republicans in general in and around Buffalo and a lot of other places where Democrats, were unsuccessful. But listen, Democrats, if you're a Democrat and your party was unsuccessful in getting people to actually vote, then or worse yet,
you'd better turn out. If they didn't learn that lesson yesterday, they're going to learn it upside the head in the 2022 midterms and in the 2024 presidential race. If you're a Democrat, get your butt out and vote. And I say that everybody should get out and vote. I say that as a left-leaning person who more often than not supports Democrats. But if Democrats want to win, they better show up.
To take the point you made a step further, who was scared? Who was afraid of the socialist tag? It sounds like Democrats were as afraid of the socialist tag as anyone else was, because you can look at any race across the whole state. One, turnout wasn't that great. Overall, like under 25%, which for an off, like a super off year, not even a midterm year, that's even bad to that standard. But also, it's not like Republicans turned out extra voters. They hardly even hit their own numbers. So, I think there's just this downplaying, or there will be this downplaying when it's, Monday morning quarterbacked in terms of why it happened or how it happened. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, as Jackie Augustine told me last night over text message while we were kind of debating what had been going on, get your people out to vote.
That's number one. But see, and here's the problem, one of the many problems that Democrats face is that their voter base is increasingly turning leftward, and the party power structure is not. I have this argument all the time. Look at who the Democrats nominate for president. Who was the least left-leaning candidate in the Democratic field for the 2020 elections? Arguably, it was Joe Biden. I mean, Pete Buttigieg, way to the left. Warren, Bernie Sanders. But yet, so you have these voters who want social change and want these left-leaning ideas, but you have a party power structure that always goes back to the middle and back to the safe course. And then the media writes stories about how the Democrats can't be so extreme and they can't be so socialist and they can't move to the left. No one ever tells Republicans they need to be less Republican. But Democrats are always being told they have to be less Democrat.
But it takes voters to get there, right?
Oh, yeah. That's number one. It takes
voters to get to that point.
Sure. And number one is get your people out. No doubt.
While I realize there is a growing percentage of the Democratic Party that wants to see the party in the country move further to the left or angle itself further to the left, I don't know at this point that the crowd or the portion of that party who feels as strongly about it as they do is any larger than, say, the farthest right portion of the voting populace. I really don't. I feel like we're talking about 10% chunks of the total population.
I mean, we're on the extremes, yes, but I think in general, Democratic voters would like their party to lean more left than it does. I think there's a fundamental, and you don't have that in the Republican Party. There's nobody. The Republican Party power structure isn't telling the party it should come back from the right. It's telling them to get further out, further out, further out.
Yeah.
But the party power structure on the Democratic side are always saying, back off, not quite so fast. And so some people are just tired. They're waiting for these changes they want to see, and they're not coming. And then we get, Joe Biden, who I'm going to bring everyone together, and he can't because everything's stacked against him. He can't get his bill through. So now he's getting blamed for everything that's wrong. I mean, now we're back to the overall view from above of politics.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let's shift gears a little bit. If you want to see or check out any of the results from last night's election, hop on Finger Lakes One, right at the top of the homepage. There's a story with spreadsheets and all kinds of things that I spent hours and hours building out yesterday. Please check those out.
And PDFs that were added together with a pencil.
Literally, lots of math was happening. So let's shift gears and talk a little bit about a proposal coming down the pipe here in Geneva. Geneva City Council is considering a resolution to effectively create a rental registry. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
We've talked about that, I feel like, a half dozen times over the last year and a half or 2 years.
Starting to get results here with the show.
Not just in Geneva, but we've talked about it in other places too. Undoubtedly, that's going to, so full disclosure, it's Wednesday. We're recording this on Wednesday. They meet tonight. It's going to be debated tonight. I'm sure it will be a big a hot button issue for city council, because this is the kind of issue that this city council really will latch onto. At any rate, thoughts on the prospect. I know we've talked about it before, but thoughts about the prospect of not only for the sake of code enforcement, which is the primary reason for it, but also so that the city can really have a good, or start to get a good sense of what they do and don't have in terms of housing market, rental market, etc.
Well, I think it's the big question is what it's going to be used for. I talked to the city manager, Sage Garling, a little bit about it this morning. I said, like you said, I think the primary purpose is to deal with problem properties.
Right.
You know, every town has them. Absentee owner,
Yeah.
you know, the place the cops get called to 4 times a week. I mean, there was the one in Auburn that they finally got shut down.
Yep.
So, you know, that's one use of it, but we've also talked about the use of it for government to take stock of its housing and say, okay, we have a problem here or we don't. Either do we have good affordable housing available or do we not? So I guess that's the question. I'll wait to see what comes out of this is, well, first off, whether there's organized opposition among landlords. I suspect that there will be, at least on some level. And then if it does go through, you know, is it going to be used just as a punitive enforcement thing or as a tool to take a look at that larger housing issue that we talk about?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at play here, for me anyway. Obviously, the rising housing costs in general, whether you're renting or buying, hop on Zillow and just take a look at how expensive houses are now compared to what they were a year or two ago, anywhere in the Finger Lakes, not just in certain communities. But also, the part that isn't mentioned in this, in the resolution, or not that I saw, but I'm sure inevitably is playing into it, is obviously the presence of the lake and Airbnbs. And that has been probably the biggest rental related issue next to absentee landlordism. I would say that has been, if you go county by county, I think most counties now in the region have established some sort of rule set for collecting taxes or trying to manage some of these properties, but it's still very, very, very difficult. And there are still, I know for a fact, in Seneca County and I believe in Yates County, not sure if Ontario County has as much of a problem with this, but there are tons of people who are renting their homes out on Airbnb or on other platforms, even just like Facebook or social media.
The town of Geneva has been dealing with this now for the last few years with a handful of people on the lake. And it's if you live, you know, if you have a nice house that you bought on the lake and then next door is a house where there's a different crowd coming in every night and they're up late and they're noisy and they don't treat it like it's theirs because it isn't. So. Yeah, that's becoming a real housing issue. And
there are so many of them still flying under the radar that, and you know, it's almost a scenario where without taking stock of everything, how can you possibly know what, especially, you know, and I almost feel like the speed at which the housing market is moving now is playing into this issue where houses are going up for sale and being sold before anyone can even really, like in a lot of cases, I've talked to folks in different neighborhoods in communities in Seneca County and in Ontario County where they didn't even know a house down the street from them was for sale, and all of a sudden there's a moving truck out front, and it's all done and gone. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here, but at the same time, go back to a conversation we had, I think either on the last podcast or the one before that, where we were talking about why is there a town of Geneva and a city of Geneva. Well, if you have the city of Geneva taking stock of this, but you don't have neighboring communities taking stock of this, I think it only goes so far, because I'm not totally sure you're going to get a complete picture of, or frankly, I'm not sure you can get a complete picture of what the housing situation is in any zip code by just one specific jurisdiction taking action. I think everyone has
but
to
it's a
take
good
action.
start. I mean, because that's the population center on that side of the county. So if you start in the city of Geneva, that's going to get you a good percentage of the housing, and then maybe other communities follow suit and say, hey, we should do this too.
Yeah, and obviously we'll talk about this one again next week once we actually have a sense of how the city is progressing with it. But I wanted to bring it up because I thought it was pretty interesting. We've now seen a few different communities. We've seen Auburn start to move forward with this. We're seeing Geneva potentially move forward with it. I think it's a matter of time before more start to latch on to the concept of let's figure out what exactly we have. Another topic here, we are getting back into COVID, unfortunately. I know some of you don't want to hear about this topic anymore, but Steuben County is doing something a little different. They're moving forward with a test to stay program for students, and I believe it also includes staff, for COVID exposure. So if a student or a teacher or staff member, I suppose, was exposed to COVID, they can get a test for 10 consecutive days, and if they continue to test negative, they can continue to stay in the building in school. Now there are a couple like caveats to it, like for example, students can only come to school and go home. There is no like in between. I don't think they can participate in sports or things
No.
like that. But
Can't go on the bus either. They've got to get
got to be
transportation.
dropped off, right? Exactly. So there are some complicating factors, but what's your sense of the move itself, and for the county to actually go in that, to see a public health entity actually go in that direction?
Well, I think the idea is great because I've said one of my great criticisms is that we've been treating people as if they all have it. This is a case of saying, okay, you were exposed. That doesn't mean you're going to get it, so we'll test you. I'm not sure why the distinction on, for example, extracurricular activities. I don't know why you can sit in a classroom all day, but you can't sit in that same classroom and be in French club after school, or for that matter, the bus, because now that introduces, talking Steuben County, which is largely rural, that introduces transportation problems for a lot of people. So I'm not sure what the reasons were for those restrictions. The idea itself, I think, is a great one.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Another thing worth pointing out: this is an option being provided by the Steuben County Public Health Department. It is not being, like, adoption is not being forced on school districts. So school districts can adopt this policy and utilize the testing. The health department will provide the testing if they so choose. I'm not sure what adoption will look like on it. I just think it's an interesting step, because even in we'll say more careful communities that have been even more careful or more cautious or skeptical about just getting back to normal, using Dr. Mendoza from Monroe County, he's been making the point repeatedly over the last 2 months that there are students missing significant amount of time in school for exposures that wind up not actually resulting in a positive test. So, it's kind of trying to figure out how to better approach that situation rather than just being overtly careful and saying, no matter what, the students just can't go to school. We can't risk it.
Well, and I also think, I think vaccinations have plateaued. I mean, other than kids, of course. We now have the vaccine rolling out for 5 to 11-year-olds. But I think among adults, it's pretty well plateaued. You can have all the clinics and all the talk you want, and I don't know how the numbers are going in terms of boosters. That'll be a whole nother set of numbers. But I think we're not going to get enough vaccinations to wipe out COVID. So the next thing becomes the testing. If we can test more frequently and more rapidly, then we can identify people who've got it and get them out of circulation so they don't spread it to others. If we do that, then I think we still have a fighting chance.
Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see how, if any other counties move in this direction with offering this kind of opportunity. Clearly, tests are readily available, and obviously that seems to be the best way forward.
And that's what a lot of people called for in place of the vaccine mandate for all the workers.
Right.
It's like, why isn't there a test out option?
So let's talk a little bit about economic development. We got the FiveYear Revive list from the Landmark Society, which every year they basically publicize a group of properties that they're eyeing for various types of grants and aid and things like that. A couple local ones came on the list, a farm in Wayne County, but most interestingly, I thought, the Phelps Hotel, which had apparently, without any fanfare at all, changed hands, and new property owners, and apparently some effort being put into rehabilitating it. Now, the reason why I want to talk about it was because I'm curious, like, the Phelps Hotel, for at least as long as I've been here at Finger Lakes 1, is like the most identifiable property in the Finger Lakes that has been vacant for the most significant amount of time, at least in terms of what I can recall it being in my youth and what other generations point to it being before I was roaming around. And it's interesting because it presents this really interesting question about what are we going to do with downtown spaces, because you have what is easily in downtown Phelps the most identifiable structures visibly when you're going through downtown, and yet very little in terms of a good feel on what exactly to do with these kinds of properties. And of course you have organizations like this, trying to put focus on rehabilitation and focus on finding money so that the properties aren't just razed and demolished. But I think in this case, I don't think there was any risk of the Phelps Hotel being demolished. Just more or less, another 5 or 10 years of vacancy probably than anything else. But it's interesting because I don't really know if anybody has a good solid idea of what to do with these growing number of large empty structures in downtown spaces.
And I don't know that there's anything you can do. I mean, we've talked about this, and we've talked about it in terms of the job market and the vacancies and the escalating salaries and the help wanted signs on every corner. The way we live is changing.
Yeah.
The days now, there's some signs of the pendulum coming back. There's signs that some younger generation want to be in walkable downtown type situations where the 50s was the era, and the 60s was the era of the strip mall. So now we've got lots of strip malls that are empty because people don't want that. So do you use economic development to fight what people want, or do you figure out what they want and give them that? That's always been one of my complaints about economic development, is it always comes from the production side. I can build the greatest peanut butter factory in the world, but if nobody wants peanut butter, I'm not going to sell any. So why give me $1 million grant to build Ted's peanut butter factory? Why don't we find out what people want and give them that? So I'm torn about it because I like anybody, I don't want to see these beautiful old buildings torn down, but what do people want in the middle of Phelps? I mean, they've got a nice village there, but it's pretty small, and it's the kind of businesses that you get, it's not your hardware stores and your kind of mainstream stuff like that. I know there's like a comic book place down there, and art galleries and things, and those are fine, but it's just not, it's not a vital sort of economic center that it probably was in, say, the 1940s.
Right. Yeah, and to that end, I think when I look at the Phelps Hotel, and really the only thing that comes to mind is housing. Like I feel like that's the only viable, restaurant perhaps, housing. It's obviously not going to be a hotel again. But then it becomes
high-end housing, and we've talked about it.
Right.
There's a need for that, but there's also a need, nobody's going to turn it into affordable apartments for middle to lower class people. If they turn it into housing, it's going to be luxury condos for the well-off.
Yeah. It's interesting. We'll see how that goes and what exactly takes place with that over the next 6 to 12 months. It was painted in the announcement as if work is happening inside regardless, so we should, in theory, start to see some changes here in the next few months to 6 months perhaps. Former Assemblyman Brian Kolb pleaded guilty to DWI. Special prosecutor in the case was unable to get the DWI charge to stick because a lack of protocols being followed during his arrest, and I believe this ties back into that camera that was running. We heard about that camera that was running in the room where they administered the breathalyzer test that was recording, and all of a sudden when the court processes changed in terms of what evidence had to be presented and made available to both sides of a case, there was effectively large gobs of data not being provided to both sides in this video that was clearly being recorded. A huge technicality. But how much of a problem is this for in Ontario County to see just the visual perception of a former assemblyman who was one of the most powerful Republicans in New York State government just effectively being able to walk free because of an issue that probably was super preventable in terms of administering those basic protocols.
It doesn't look good, and it goes back to what we were talking about with low voter turnout. People see things like this and they go, the powerful get their way. I mean, I know people that have had DWI convictions and it wasn't 90 days.
Yeah.
And so the perception there is that if you're powerful enough and spend enough money, you can have a minimized punishment. So I'm curious if that's the way the camera was running in his case. Was it also doing that in other people's cases? And are we going to have 100 DWI attorneys trying to reopen cases now?
And I believe that was one of the original concerns. And I believe Ontario County was one of the leaders in the state in terms of DWI conviction.
It has been the leader for, I believe, 34 of the last 35 years. I might be off. Sorry, Sue Sorencione, if I'm off. She's the coordinator, I think. She was last I knew.
So
They take big pride, and that's a big point of pride in Ontario County.
So maybe a couple of those years they might be losing that title, just as a put a little asterisk next to it. Also, another item here that I want to hit on before we get to the end of the show. New survey shows that workers are afraid to call in after the pandemic. And I thought it was interesting because we've been talking about how workers are jumping ship, how workers have the advantage right now in ways that they really never have before in terms of how much money they can make in the job market. But at the same time, I've seen this very real thing play out where workers in all different lines of work are either because of their employer being short-staffed or just simple like fear of retribution for not going to work are not calling in when they probably should not be going to work. For example, if you're feeling under the weather, you would think by now we've learned our lesson with if you're sick, stay home. But no, it seems like we're going back the other way, and everyone's okay with it.
I know that's been the perception for a while. It would seem to me that right now would be a time that you wouldn't be as afraid of that, because if your employer gives you grief, I mean, there's still a lot of jobs available,
Yeah.
and they pay decent money. A lot of them that I mean, we had when the minimum wage went to $12.50, a lot of people told us that was going to be the end of the world. And now we have people, offering 18, 19, 20 or more
Yeah.
for kind of not high skill jobs, warehouse positions, just physical work where you can, if you're able to show up and do it, you can get that money. So it would seem to me that and maybe employees are late to realize that they have more power now than they used to. When there are no other jobs out there, you got to take what you're given. When there's a job on every street corner, you can say, hey, you know what? If you don't like it that I call in sick, I'll go somewhere else.
Well, my question was with this, are we looking at like delayed data? So are we looking at data that was maybe collected during, say, the spring and summer when maybe people were still, were coming out of more severe restrictions and people are a little more on edge and not sure about what their employer is going to say or what they're going to think. Now fast forward to where we are at this point, and I think it's really clear that, like you said, not only does the employee have the power, but most employers are pretty understanding about, like, if you're sick, stay home. We just prefer you.
That could
to
be,
not
but I
infect.
think sometimes perception is late catching up to reality. So I think for workers that have been in these jobs where it's like, oh my God, if I call in sick, I'll get fired. And maybe they still would. I don't know. And there's still, that's a pretty existential fear. You don't want to lose your job. So I think maybe that not all of them realize that they have more options now than they normally would. And I'll be fascinated to see, how long is this going to last? Is there going to be a correction at some point where, it's funny because pre-pandemic, we used to talk about how there weren't going to be nearly enough jobs for everybody who wants one. I mean, that seems a little dated now, doesn't it?
It certainly does. Not only on top of that, but every week we've talked about unemployment rates and how you can look at the data a whole bunch of different ways. But at the end of the day, there are more people grabbing onto jobs and jumping ship a lot faster than they ever have in the past. And it's created a scenario where, the stakes have changed, and people definitely should not be afraid to call in, especially if they are sick. It's funny, like
a new rate. We always hear about unemployment rate. Now we're hearing about the quit rate. The quit rate in America for August was something like a little over 3%. 1 out of every 33 Americans said, I'm done.
Well, in big picture, I think, look, like this is something we'll talk about in the future for sure, but a lot of people get annoyed with, all this talk about stimulus and another stimulus, or whether like payments should be regular or universal basic income or something along those lines. I think we're headed that direction because I think the only way at this point, is as terrible as it may sound to say for some folks who believe in a full day's work for a full day's pay, the only way you get people to buy back in is if you guarantee them a quality of life. That's the only way you're going to get people to recommit to jobs that don't yield a quality of life that aligns with what the American dream promised them a decade or two or three ago.
Well, but, I mean, right now these jobs do. I mean, McDonald's in Geneva and Canandaigua are hiring $15 an hour. That's $31,500, I think, a year. That's more than people made in food service a few. I mean, even accounting for inflation.
Yeah.
It's it's not that hard. It used to be pretty hard to find a job that pays decent money. It's really not that hard right now. I mean, watch the signs when you drive along 5 and 20 or listen to the help wanted ads on the radio.
I mean, I think the one caveat I'd throw on that is, even if you are working one of these jobs where you're making 15 or 18 or 20 or $22 an hour, I've gotten into arguments in the past with, I hate to say it, boomers on Twitter about this. Is like living off of $20 or $22 an hour seems really easy to do when your house is paid off, you're 60 years old, and you've worked for 30 years, and everything is like your life is more or less set. But if you have $100,000 in student loans, if you are trying to figure out how you can possibly afford $1,400 or $1,500 in rent, if you're having to deal with all of that on top of just rising prices of literally everything, $15, $18, $20 an hour, you need two of those incomes.
Okay.
So, for couples, I think it works out. But for the individual, like, we're still not to a point where, and that's where I think at some point we're going to see government step in. Whether it's framed as something, whether Republicans frame it as something different down the road to equalize how easy it is to have access to these things like home ownership and, affordable housing, or even just, transportation, like all of these things that are becoming more expensive by the day. At some point, we're going to see some kind of shift.
You make a good point there, but you also brought something up about student debt, and I think one of the great scandals of our time is that it's now become an expectation that you will go into debt basically the amount of a house or more before you graduate college. I think that's a problem.
Yep.
You should not enter the adult working world already having essentially bought a house, only not buying a house. I mean, that $100,000, $200,000 debt, especially in an economy that doesn't necessarily reward those degrees anymore with additional income or additional job opportunities. Why do you want to go in debt for $100,000 when you could come out of high school and get one of those $20 an hour jobs and start making $40,000? I tell you, I wasn't making $40,000 when I was 18, even inflation adjusted to today.
Yeah. Well, and to that end, I think one of the things that, you use this as a very easy example, mortgage lending is something that's going to have to change fundamentally over the next decade to 2 decades. Otherwise, homeownership is going to be completely impossible for 80% of the population. I mean, the number of people in my circles over the last 3 to 4 years who've been denied over and over again mortgages that effectively account for a 40 to 60% reduction in what their monthly expenditure is on housing by banks is just, it's absurd. Like, if you pay $1,500 or $1,600 a month in rent and you've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, and the bank says, no, you can't get approved for this mortgage that's only $1,100, not only are you sending a freaking bizarre message, but you're also pointing to just how outdated and broken that process is.
Well,
clearly.
But at some point, the banks are going to have to start lending to those people because they're going to run out of people. I mean, my generation's dying off, so there's only going to be so many people. They want to loan money out. So I think at some point they're going to, and maybe that's another whole re-examination that people will have. I mean, another topic for another day, but if I bought a home relatively late in life, having gone through home ownership now for 18 years, if I had it to do over again, I'm not sure I would have done it.
Interesting.
Just real quick, one of the things that you're sold for home ownership is that your payment will stay the same. Rents go up and up and up and up. Well, when you add in taxes, my mortgage payment's gone up and up and up and up. It's about probably 75 to 80% higher than it was 18 years ago when I bought the house.
Interesting. Yeah, and it's all of these things are loosely connected or fully connected in we'll definitely be getting into that one probably in the next couple weeks here. But in the meantime, where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm the host of the Finger Lakes Morning News and Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that's 96.3 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA, Monday through Friday, 5:30 to 9.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. We'll be back next week. Until then, stay tuned to FingerLakes1.com for the latest news, weather, sports, and podcasts. See you later.